Hey guys, my name is Shreyas and welcome to Simple Biology. In this video we're going to be looking at the origin of life. Many centuries ago, explorers had discovered fossils and understood how it revealed information about the past. We talked about this in our fossil record video. Fossils are a great source of evidence for evolution. Fossils showed how past organisms were very different from the present. And these fossils also demonstrated this important concept that you need to know, macroevolution. Macroevolution is the pattern of evolution above the species level. We've been talking about microevolution, and microevolution was change in allele frequencies. Macroevolution, you can think of that as above speciation. It's really this complete change over time. Now let's talk about how it's kind of like a history lesson. Let's talk about first the beginning of the Earth all the way to the human beings we see today and the animals we see today. So the beginning of the Earth was formed from a cloud of dust and rocks that surrounded the sun. Millions of years later, Earth had become covered with rock and ice from the collisions of the solar system. These collisions generated lots of heat, which vaporized the remaining water on Earth, preventing the formation of seas and lakes, so there was no life because of that. Millions of years later, life was introduced on planet Earth. So as the Earth slowly cooled down, you could have water. Earth's atmosphere, whenever life was first introduced to Earth, was covered with very little oxygen, and the water vapor and compounds were released from volcanic eruptions. As Earth cooled down, this water vapor condensed, and then eventually we had oceans, and it allowed for hydrogen to escape into space, therefore making the conditions on Earth more and more suitable for life. So let's talk about how life actually originated, the first organism. So these two scientists right here, Oparin and Haldane, hypothesized that Earth's atmosphere was a reducing environment, meaning that it takes electrons. Okay, so takes electrons and basically becomes creates more and more complex molecules, from something like as simple as CO2 to something as complex as glucose. So that's reducing. Now, they also believe that organic compounds were formed from simpler molecules through lightning and UV radiation. So lightning and UV radiation gave energy in order for these simple compounds to come together and form more complex compounds. And they also believe that organic compounds were formed in vents. The two types of vents that they thought organic compounds were formed in were hydrothermal vents and alkaline vents. Hydrothermal vents are areas on the seafloor where hot water and minerals are produced, and they're the interior of Earth, like the mantle, near volcanoes. Alkaline vents are areas of the seafloor that release warm water, and those are more suited for environment than hydrothermal vents. Now, the Miller-Urey experiment really showed how organic molecules form. So just think of it like this. You first need the simple molecules to form, and that was formed from the formation of Earth. Then from there, you need to have organic molecules, and from organic molecules, only then can you have life. So that's like kind of the sequence I'm going through right now. So this experiment kind of showed how organic molecules probably were synthesized. It's from these two great scientists, Miller and Urey. So if you look here, you have water, and it's being heated. This kind of demonstrates the sun. Not the sun, the oceans. And as that water is heated, it gets turned into water vapor, and it turns into a gas. There, it interacts with CH4, NH3, H2. These molecules here, this is ammonia, this is hydrogen gas, this is methane. And this the spark that they've used in this experiment, it represents lightning. So when that happens, the water and the CH4, the NH2, the H2 react, and when it gets cooled down, and it's released here in this little beaker. If you look at this, there's organic compounds. So basically, this experiment showed that if you can do this on a tiny scale with this little mechanism you have here, it also demonstrates how maybe organic compounds are created in Earth. Water representing the sea, this representing the atmosphere at the time the Earth was first formed, and the the electric spark representing lightning. Okay. There's a lot of theories on how organic molecules were created. There's also a theory that maybe a meteor collided with Earth, which already had organic molecules, and that was is where organic molecules formed. There's so many theories. Just make sure you know that the ones I mentioned in this PowerPoint. Okay. The fossil record shows how Earth has been lasting for a very long time and how it evolved over time. It also shows how organisms have changed and become extinct over time. And it also shows how new species arose from previous existing species. I feel like I've said this like so many times, but make sure you know this, okay? However, the fossil record is not completely accurate. Many organisms might have died at the wrong place or the wrong time. Maybe it's not. Scientists might look at these fossils disappearing and they might think it's an extinction event, but it might have just been an organism just dying because of something on a rock fell out on it or something like that. And many fossils may have lost, and only a few might have been discovered, right? So you never know if the fossil record's actually accurate because there might be other fossils that we've just not found yet, or maybe those fossils have just eroded and we're missing a big piece. So the fossil record is not completely accurate, remember that. Now, this is an important process to know how scientists determine the age of a fossil. They use a process called radiometric dating, and radiometric dating is a method of determining the age of fossils by basing it off the decay of radioactive isotopes. Okay, so basically radioactive isotopes, those are atoms which become unstable and start breaking into different parts. So a parent isotope decays to its daughter isotopes at a given rate, and that rate is called a half-life. That's the time for 50% of a parent isotope to decay. For example, carbon-14 decays relatively fast. The half-life of that is 5,000 years. Uranium-238 decays relatively slow. The half-life of that is 5 billion years. So one can determine the age of the fossil in sedimentary rocks through the ages of its through radiometric dating, and also as well as looking at the rocks which are surrounding it. So, for example, a fossil located between two volcanic rocks, which are typically 490 to 500 million years old, can be thought to be 495 million years old because they're in between. We talked about this kind of with strata. Go check that out. That's in the first video. This concept right here of strata and rocks coming on top of each other. Okay, let's get back to, these are fossils, by the way. So let's get back to, first, we're talking about this, geological record. Okay, the geological record is a scale describing the time and relationship of events that have occurred throughout Earth's history. Okay, this is basically how scientists talk about the history of the Earth as well as the history of life. So it's divided into 4 eons and 3 eras. The 4 eons are the Hadean, the Archean, the Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic eons, and the eras are Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. You don't need to know these for AP biology, we just kind of threw it in here. Just know that it's divided into 4 eons and 3 eras. Each era represents a distinct age in the history of life, history of Earth as well as life, and the boundaries between these eras, are, like for example, the boundary between the Paleozoic era and the Mesozoic era, each represent a major extinction event. Okay, finally we can go back to life. So we said first we talked about how the Earth formed and how you have simple compounds. Then we talked about how organic molecules formed. Now let's talk about the actual first living organism, and those are called protocells. And protocells may have been formed from fluid-filled vesicles. Vesicles are kind of like tiny little sacs, which have a membrane-like structure. And these protocells exhibited simple reproduction. Okay, just like all life exhibits reproduction. So they exhibited simple reproduction and metabolism. And metabolism is just like chemical reactions. And they maintained an internal chemical environment, which was basically enough for scientists to say, okay, because these protocells could do that, they can be considered the first living organism. And how they formed is probably in water. So in water, lipids and other organic molecules can spontaneously form vesicles with the lipid bilayer. Okay, so basically what this bullet point is saying is that in water, organic molecules can start to start to combine and form a membrane. A membrane is basically a lipid bilayer. You'll be learning more about this later in the chemistry of life if you haven't learned that already. And adding clay, clay is very common, can also increase the rate of vesicle formation. So that's probably how organic molecules formed protocells, through this process right here. Okay. The origin of self-replicating molecules, the first genetic material was probably RNA, not DNA, because RNA is not as complex as DNA. RNA is single-stranded and it can form 3D shapes by folding over on itself. Okay, and because it can form 3D shapes, it can act as an enzyme. An enzyme is a type of molecule which can catalyze reactions. It's just like you can think of it like a little factory for reactions. And those are called ribozymes. And ribozymes can catalyze self-replication of DNA. So since RNA can kind of replicate itself by forming these little factories called ribozymes, scientists think that RNA was probably the first genetic material. Okay, now let's talk about the first single-celled organisms. The earliest forms of life on Earth were stromatolites and prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are single-cell organisms without a nucleus. Examples of this are bacteria and cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are bacteria that performs photosynthesis, basically, taking light and turning that into energy that the cell can use. Stromatolites are a mound of layered rocks that form when certain prokaryotes bind thin pieces of sediment together, and they're found in present-day marine bays. Then we have photosynthesis. So again, I mentioned this earlier in the video. We talked about how at the very beginning of life we didn't have oxygen, but most of the atmospheric oxygen that we have today in our atmosphere is of biological origin. It didn't come from volcanoes or meteorites or anything like that. It came from actually living organisms. So prokaryotes, which are similar to today's cyanobacteria, were the first photosynthesizers. Okay, and they took light as well as carbon dioxide and water, and they formed usable compounds that they could use for energy, as well as oxygen. The oxygen was kind of a byproduct of this reaction. And because these prokaryotes started forming oxygen, it started to accumulate in the atmosphere, and this is called the oxygen revolution. And the thing with the oxygen revolution was that some organisms could not support oxygen, so it killed off much of the life on Earth because organisms could not deal with the toxic oxygen at the time. So the organisms that could survive with the oxygen began using it to get energy. So they started taking advantage of the oxygen actually, and they used that in a process called cellular respiration. And you maybe have heard of this, maybe you've not, but just know this. The first eukaryotes. Okay, so eukaryotes were formed hundreds of millions of years ago, after prokaryotes. Eukaryotes are organisms that contain membrane-bound organelles, and they're significantly more complex than prokaryotes. Unlike prokaryotes, eukaryotes contain a cytoskeleton, a feature that allows the cell to change its shape, actually. Now, when you talk about eukaryotes, we talk about the endosymbiont theory. This is very critical theory. And this is a theory that states how mitochondria and plastids are chloroplasts, were once small prokaryotes that lived within larger cells. Okay, so it basically describes the process of how chloroplasts and mitochondria started to emerge within cells. So an endosymbiont is a cell that lives within another cell, the host cell, and it can occur through undigested prey or parasites. So what scientists basically thought in the endosymbiont theory is that you had these large cells, and they started to consume these cyanobacteria, as well as organisms which could perform cellular respiration, and eventually, with time, they start to combine together in order to form this chloroplast. So you can think of it like it's first there's those cyanobacteria and the aerobic prokaryotes, the cells that can perform respiration, came into the larger cells, and they kind of just stuck there. And eventually, those prokaryotes which came in turned into the chloroplasts and the mitochondria that we see today. Now, the evidence that supports the endosymbiont theory is these 4 bullet points right here. The inner membranes of chloroplasts and mitochondria are very similar to the plasma membranes of prokaryotes. Okay, so that's one big clue. Another big clue is that chloroplasts and mitochondria divide in a process which it looks similar to prokaryotic cell division. The third clue is that the DNA found in chloroplasts and mitochondria is similar to the DNA found in prokaryotes. Both of them are a single circular chromosome, so that's also another big piece of evidence. The final piece of evidence that supports the endosymbiont theory is that the ribosomes found in mitochondria and chloroplasts are more similar to prokaryotic ribosomes than eukaryotic ribosomes. If you don't know what a ribosome is, ribosomes are basically the factories for the cell. They create materials, they create proteins. That's besides the point. Just note these 4 bullet points. These are the big evidence that supports the endosymbiont theory. Important to know. Okay, finally, we can talk about the origin of multicellular organisms. The introduction of eukaryotic cells created a diversity in life. The first eukaryotes that appeared were single-celled. Okay, so they're just one cell. Many years later, single-cell eukaryotes gave rise to multicellular forms, so organisms which have more than one cell, like algae, plants, fungi, and animals. The earliest multicellular eukaryotes were probably small red algae. Larger eukaryotes started appearing around 600 million years ago. These fossils are referred to as Ediacaran biota. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. You might want to check that. But these organisms are soft-bodied organisms. They're very squishy, you know. But before the rise of these large multicellular eukaryotes, the Earth was a very microbial world, meaning that you only had tiny organisms. You didn't have any big organisms. Only then, after many years, did we get these large multicellular organisms that you see today. So before the Cambrian explosion, all of the large animals were soft-bodied, very squishy. And most of these organisms were typically scavengers rather than predators. You didn't see any animals starting to attack each other for food. However, there was a big period in history called the Cambrian explosion, and this is where we start to see the first large, hard-bodied animals that started appearing. So after the Cambrian explosion, we started to see predators. We started to see the animals kind of like what we see today, like dinosaurs with claws, sharp spines, heavy body armor. These soft-bodied organisms kind of went away, and we have the organisms that we see today. The colonization of land. This is also a very big part of the history of life. This is basically organisms moving from water, which way they originated. Remember, I said protocells were probably formed in water, So the colonization of land is a very important piece when organisms moved from water onto the land and started living there. There is evidence that cyanobacteria and prokaryotes were the first to cover Earth's damp surfaces, which was land. Later, larger forms of life, fungi, plants, and animals started appearing. The ability to move to land, you might be thinking, why did organisms just not get on land and start living there? It's actually harder for organisms at the time for them to live on land than it was for water because of these 3 reasons. They had to be able to reproduce on land. They had to be able to prevent dehydration, losing water. Sorry, those are just 2 points. For example, many plants have waterproof coatings of wax on their leaves that help them prevent dehydration. Okay, but the living organisms of the time did not have that, so it took a very long time for these organisms to colonize on land. How did organisms colonize land? Sometimes plants and fungi would work together to survive on land. So plants use fungi in absorption of water and minerals from soil, and the fungi use plants to obtain their nutrients, kind of like a teamwork, something like that. The most common and diverse land animals were arthropods, which were insects and spiders, and tetrapods. So the arthropods came first, okay? And then finally, after time, we started to see the development of tetrapods, and humans are tetrapods. Okay, I know that was a lot, but that's the origin of life. Now you know how all life was created. But stay tuned for more videos, but that's it for now. Origin of life is as simple as that.